So we've covered quite some meaty topics today, and a few times I've had to tell you to hold your questions. So this is where I tell you not to hold your questions. And just sort of a brief sort of discussion we had at our last DPC event. Honestly, there are no stupid questions. I can guarantee you, if you're worried about asking it, there's definitely someone else in this room who has the same question, potentially me. So I will just open up the floor. Feel free to address a question or a comment to a specific speaker. Feel free to address it just to the whole panel, and whoever wants to take it can take it. All right, Paul, we'll start with you in just a moment. And just a reminder to the speakers, you are also allowed to ask each other questions. So don't feel like you're barred from speaking to each other. And if there's anything burning you realized you forgot to say, feel free as well to share that in the panel session. All right, Paul Stokes, take it away.
Okay, Paul Stokes from GIS. This one's for all the panel. In the context of research data preservation, what would you consider to be the minimum viable product for a preservation system that claims to undertake software preservation?
No one jumping for the microphone there. Natasha, it's in front of you. Here, sorry, you need the microphone for the streaming people.
So this question has always had two parts. One is whether we're talking technical feasibility, or we're talking about sustainability and business viability. Both, yeah. So as I said, I'm professor at University of Nottingham, and every semester I've got a couple of students with leaving behind undergraduate thesis, and the university does take care of operational part, but then this legacy part is more about the practice, to be honest, than technical feasibility. It's about getting new practice in and then sustaining that practice over time, and then it's in the hands of the IT. And the priority of whether IT will be putting fires, watching your email and shares, or whether they're going to be taking care of something that is very rarely used. So basically my answer here is, technically, I don't think there are any barriers. From the practice point of view, you need to basically run all the operations and see how you're going to prioritize, and finally, you need to basically crystal clear who this is providing value to and how it's going to be funded. And that last bit, I'll be honest, I couldn't figure out for academia. That's why we went to industry.
I focus on the technical part, or on the workflow part. I think the minimal viable product is you have to bring together two DOIs. One for the methodology, so it's the model, and one for the data. And to bring these things together on the fly, I think that will make the product. And because especially if you can mix and match, so you have the old model with new data, and you have the old data with the new model, and then you can see if that makes sense. And then you can really make a discussion out of it. No one actually expects that you actually use the old model in a productive setting, because it's old software. It might be clumsy, it might be slow, it might be not appropriate for your current workflow. But at least have the option to put the data into the old model, and to get a feeling if you're on the right path. I think that's the interesting part. And of course, to make that work, I mean, we can iterate it down to various technical problems. There are a lot of them, like how do you describe the data format, how you describe the process that it actually works, and so on and so on. But essentially, it breaks down to these two things. And to make the model work in the long term, and to make the data useful in the long term, you have to consider some preservation practice, which I think is underrated and undervalued yet in the research data management domain.
Well, okay, so I'm trying to provide, that's a very interesting question from my point of view. The point is that you have so many different kinds of data and so many different kinds of software, and you have also economical issues. I mean, are you really ready to spend 1 million to make sure one particular kind of data is readable by one person in 10 years? That's not clear. I mean, you really need to do. What I believe is really fundamental, a minimum thing that everybody should be doing is to actually document what they do with their data and what software they use, and use identifier that can actually live for a long time. So for example, what we do in our world, we use checksum on the data, we use checksums on the software. This is what we do as software developers daily. So we do not use DOIs, okay, on software, for example, because it just doesn't work. When I talk to a friend of mine working on a system that we are developing together, I do not tell them this is a DOI of the version you are working on. I share with him the commit hash that corresponds to what we are doing, because I'm sure what I'm looking at. And this is part of the development workflow that researchers should use if they want to be able themselves to reproduce their own results a little bit later. Unfortunately, I have to say the practices, according to the different fields of research, are very disparate. So you have people that do a fantastic job of documenting everything, because, for example, they are maintaining a system that has been developed for 30 years and they need to run regression tests and all these kind of things. So they have all this harness developed around it. And you have other people that just write 100 lines of code for one paper, throw it away with the data, and move to the next paper. So it's too diverse. So the minimum viable product, I'm not sure it exists. It really depends on the people you're addressing.
Any other questions? Yes, Matthew, you can ask a question.
I'm interested in preservation of software when it's running as a service. So I'm thinking about things like Office 365 or Google Docs. I'm thinking about Microsoft's xCloud for running games without using a console. I'm thinking of bioinformatics workflows that use hosted services, where you can't get your hands on the software in the sense of a shrink wrap piece of software that you download as a binary, or you can't see the source code. Any thoughts on how to go about capturing, preserving software when it's running as a service?
Well, we just discovered this. It's one interesting part working in preservation is you still have a bit of time. So we are currently looking back at the early 2000s, between early 2000s 2010, which wasn't that important right now. So it's coming, it's emerging, so we have a bit of time to adapt. One thing what we usually propose is to think, if you think about emulation, not only to think about computers. You have to emulate an ecosystem in this sense. So we have an interesting use case from the digital art where you have a server who connects to the old Google API to do some search and does some artistic thing, so it doesn't matter. But the Google Search API has changed. So they used SOAP previously, now they use a RESTful service. So what we do is we emulate that. We emulate the interface and let the server untouched and to work in a curated way. So you need some extra curation in this sense. So you need to make philosophical or curational decisions on top. What is important? What do you want to show in this way? I think this is also very important for the game community. So it's not anymore. It's not that simple anymore that you just convert a Word document into a PDF-A. You have to think a bit more what you want to preserve and what you want to achieve. So there is, as I said, a lot of PhD opportunities there.
Are you recruiting, Klaus?
Yeah.
Yes.
They're recruiting.
I'd like to just comment on this from the principal point of view again. Technically, I doubt there's a big problem. You just need to speak with Microsoft, because they're probably running everything in virtual machines already. So they'll just hand it over to you, and you keep it. The question only is, why would they do this? And it has to be a win-win. So as a matter of principle, with the way we are looking at the ecosystem, you cannot go and say, I want to preserve something without talking to ICT industry. Just cannot. And that has been ongoing attitude that I'm seeing, as if this is an evil a part of the ecosystem where you can't possibly negotiate, you can't talk to them. I just basically would like to suggest that, in fact, we need them on our side. We need to understand what the value is for them. And I'm pretty sure that we will be finding very willing participants, especially when it comes to the citizenship and the pains that they are very much aware they're creating through the innovation. I was at Microsoft for 17 years, so I know how Microsoft works. At a UNESCO conference where we are looking at persist and initiatives, Microsoft was Roundtable, and so IBM and others. And they were just asking us, what would you like? What do you want? And guess what? We didn't know. We didn't have a coherent message to say, this is what we want. I can show you emails, but they asked me, which of the software packages would you like? We didn't have the list. So I want to say is, I think what we need to do is just change a little bit the attitude and think they're not evil. We can probably befriend them, and they will give us 365 as well. Yeah.
So from a gaming point of view, yes, the thing didn't mention when I was talking was the things like digital distribution, increasing the things like authentication servers that get deactivated or retired, streaming services, whole class of new gaming devices that have been announced recently. So I guess there's to some extent there's kind of two approaches. So one has been the kind of thought experiment, which really sort of predicated, the work before was predicated on, to thinking about, so in the case of games, that playability might actually be a finite state. And that not being a defeatist attitude, but actually being a really liberating one, to say that actually this thing is going to have a number of different sort of stages in its sort of life cycle. That's what Ray Gwyn's called the kind of afterlife of a game, where it'll continue to exist, but maybe it's not playable in the original form. And so there's something else we can then do that's quite a liberating kind of point to get to, where you think, okay, so how could we document it? How could we talk about it? What would we want to keep? So that, to some extent, it's that question about deciding what we want to acquire, whether that be from players, whether that's from developers and designers. So there's a kind of documentation project that emerges from actually thinking, well, maybe actually keeping this stuff, in the case of games, playable forever isn't actually the objective. But there's another kind of project as well, I think, which is about making the case. I mean, one of the biggest challenges we've found working with developers has been just making the case for preservation. And actually what we really need, really case studies of that. So a lot of the work that we're kind of currently doing, and to some extent it's the sort of low-hanging fruit, but it's about working with developers who own their own IP to start to build those kind of cases, look at the kinds of materials that a cultural institution might be interested in, start to acquire that material, work with those developers, hopefully then to create that case that you can then put to other developers, other publishers, to demonstrate so in our case, the cultural value of this material. Because some of the time, it's actually the material that a curator or might really want is actually the stuff that the developer isn't that concerned about and might actually have discarded. So to some extent, creating those kind of both business cases, use cases, and that range of materials through a really sort of demonstrable case study, I think, is one of the great opportunities that we have. I'm also recruiting for PhD students as well, so I think that's a fantastic opportunity there.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things we're doing at the moment is working with some colleagues in Japan as part of an ESRC-funded project, looking at the kind of best practices and the challenges of doing game. This is more focused around exhibition, but it's the similar kind of questions about what materials are available, the questions around IP and ownership. Even if you work with an organisation or an individual who's willing to give you the material, there've often been so many companies changing hands, being bought out, that actually it's quite difficult to work out where the ownership of materials is. So I think starting to work through some of those case studies to make that case more strongly is possibly one of the things that is most urgent.
Just one further remark on the software as a service part. I had to rush through that slide. There's a lot more to flesh out. One important remark I want to place here, because this is about software preservation. If we don't solve this problem, we will never be able to properly preserve apps, because apps are more or less software as a service. So it's just a different kind of a browser you have installed on your when you open the app. But effectively, in most apps, the magic happens on the server side. So if you want to tackle that problem at some point, and I think it's important because it's part of our culture right now, we have to think about this problem too.
Yes, I mean, overall, I mean, in the world we are living in right now, and this interconnection with the network servers all over the place makes everything related to preservation extremely complicated. Also because you need to talk to a lot of people. I mean, you have applications that can piggyback on 10 or 20 different APIs coming from different places. So you get a map from Google Maps, you get information from LinkedIn, you get information from Twitter, you get information from Facebook, etc. So you need to have all this, and all these are different players you need to talk to. So I forgot to mention before, I brought some documentation on the work we are doing on software edge. I will repeat here, and I have some copies of this Paris Declaration we published with UNESCO a couple of months ago. One of the elements which is there among the different suggestions is to try to address a software vendor and software user and developers, and to tell them that they should consider what they do when decommissioning their system from the very beginning, be it part of the way they think about it. I mean, making it a legal obligation seems a kind of overkill because sometimes it can be too costly, but at least bringing this idea in their mind from the very beginning with different kind of arguments about cultural heritage, about their visibility. I mean, you should be proud of what you have done, for example. You should be happy to release your software later on. I have a very beautiful example. If you remember Doom and Quake, etc., the authors of these games, which were groundbreaking at the moment, in particular John Carmack, who is an incredible programmer, they decided to make the software open source. They released the engine, you can find it. I mean, we also archive it. I mean, Doom, Quake Arena, this kind of stuff. And why did they do this? Because they were proud of what they did. I mean, there are many motivations for actually releasing software. The only point is that if you don't think about this from the beginning, it is extremely costly to do it later. Okay? Because this means also keeping track of intellectual property that comes from other places, keeping track of potentially private information you should not release that is in part of the code. So if it is in your mind, in your process from the beginning, you might do it. If it is not, that's very complicated. It's much more costly.
Would just echo that in terms of those sort of developing preservation-friendly workflows, that this is something which is baked into the process of, so you know, the case I'm thinking about is in terms of game making, it's something which is very difficult, as you say, to kind of retrofit. So the development of those methods, and this is like sort of inculcating this through you know kind of university curricula. So it was very much one of the opportunities and one of the recommendations that we sort of made. At the end of the research last year, that was there was a real opportunity there to start to value those kinds of materials, and for universities to build that into their into the development cycle, and also to start to manage archives of student development work as well. So that becomes hopefully becomes something which is baked into and part of the process of making games, rather than something which we're now having to deal with and sort of battle against.
That reminds me another thing. I mean, these different. We talk about software as a generic thing, but there are many different areas. For example, in the gaming area, that was funny. I mean, it was things. Some 10 years ago, I oversaw a report for the Ministry of Research and Innovation in France on this software industry. And so we went and talked to the people in France that do game. There are bunch of things like Ubisoft, Blizzard, etc., which are pretty famous, and ask them what are the intellectual property tools they use to protect their games. And for example, what about patents? And there's patents. Who cares? I mean, it's an industry where the importance is speed. You need to roll out your new game. You gain your money in 6 months, and that's it. And then you move to the next stuff. Okay, so it's easier to get them on board on decommissioning than other people, because all the money they did is basically in the first year or so. So if we should be able to convince them to take a second step by saying, not only I made money, but now I'm also very good and popular, and they do this and make it available for the future. We need to package the argument in a proper way, but I think there is a possibility. Pretty different from a vendor like Oracle that is making money on top of Oracle databases since ages, and will not release the source code of their database, not even the old ones.
We maybe have time for one more question. I think Roberto's got to dash back to France. Yeah, bye. Thank you very much, Roberto. But if you do want more information about Software Heritage, he has left some goodies behind that are up at the front. But yeah, just before we wrap up, do we have any final questions for our speakers? Oh,
sorry, this is just.
Oh, sorry, Patricia.
Klaus, you mentioned you were looking at metadata for software environments, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
This is not my primary domain. We were never good at metadata since we do this. So we have some experts, Kat Ronson from Yale. She's very engaged in the Wikidata community, and they are collecting in a coordinated way metadata about software. So there are some upcoming publications on that. So I have to refer to that, but because this is not my primary domain. What my domain is, we need this data to make the service useful. So if you come with an object, we have tools like Droid or Siegfried. They can say, okay, this is that file format. But there is still no comprehensive database which refers to the format, from the format to a proper software stack for some unknown reasons, to me at least. So we cannot say, or if you scan your collection, I mean, you can run Siegfried or Droid in a very convenient way through all your collection, and then you get a bunch of file formats you found it. It would be cool to have a tool which created you an 80-20 approach. So this is the 5 environments you need, the 5 software environments you need, which solves 80% of your holdings, and you can render them again. So this is a very good starting point for a curator to say, okay, I focus on these, and the other 20%, well, we will push that for the later task. But the metadata side is pretty weak on this still. It's getting better. I think we are currently. You have to refer to the paper, but the number is significant. What they are adding to Wikidata in these terms currently.
With respect to metadata, again, as far as Interact Digital goes, there are different layers of it. So we're very much aware that there have been attempts to create almost a standard towards describing software, and that's absolutely kind of a good starting point. However, when you have a service, just like Klaus mentioned, then you have metadata about the service itself. So how do you compose configurations for individual needs? So this is another level of metadata. And then on top of it, there is, of course, what are the licenses associated with this? So it's very much operational. So I'm anticipating that the way things are going to go is as we see more and more services in the marketplace that are going to serve software. So you are here just a kind of couple of pioneers here on the table who are trying to change this by creating a second-hand software market, practically. It's a secondary market in a kind of win-win way, so that we can approach the vendors and say, look, we are happy to distribute your legacy software. How much money do you want? We just share. And often the answer is, well, this is such a peanuts that we don't want to even bother about this. But I just want to say, secondary market for software needs to come in place in order to facilitate this longevity. And with that, there will be either de facto standards on the metadata that will evolve, or if the community has something forward that is really strongly believes in, I'm sure that services would take it, because if there is a chance to be interoperable with libraries and archives on other operational levels, And the operational level of services, I think, is a win-win for everybody, and it's just a common sense, yeah.
So, so within game preservation, there's a real opportunity. It was a real lack of standardized metadata for games. There's been a couple of projects that have kind of led the way. There was an IMLS funded project, which was led by Stanford University Libraries and University Santa Cruz. That one of the outcomes of that project was the creation of a controlled vocabulary list for platforms, terminology list. And all, it's a comprehensive piece of work, which is also now comprehensive year out of date, because this stuff likes to keep changing. So it's not only is it the beginnings of working out what those kind of controlled vocabularies are, and then maybe implementing those, making them interoperable, thinking about the vast array of cataloging schemes that are in place across institutions across the world, as well as those kind of private collectors I was talking about before. So there's a real, there's a really urgent kind of job to be done there as well. So I think at the beginning of that, and there is some really interesting work starting to happen there, but it's still very much sort of the early days, and it needs to be maintained as well, because the nature of this stuff is that it's it isn't, you can't freeze it.
Yeah, it evolves really. I mean, this is an amazing bit, because the way software evolves these days is really rapid, and so maintaining anything static is not going to work. So it has to be flexible. It has to be able to sustain a change. Yeah.
I think we're going to draw a line under it there, just to sort of have our final wrap up. Please do get in touch though if you have any other questions, or if there's information you'd like to circulate or to share. And thank you again for our last three speakers. So just one final round of applause for them for making it through the whole way. And we've already mentioned the upcoming DPC briefing day with JISC on valuing digital information and on calculating costs. Again, that's on the 29th of May, and registration is open. I can't let you go without one final slug, particularly for DPC members, but today we have released for member preview the DPC Technology Watch report on preserving email, the second edition by Chris Prom. So if you go into the news section of the website, make sure you're logged in. You can get an early glimpse at that report. And finally, you will get another email from me, hopefully first thing tomorrow morning, with our feedback form. So that is now online, just in an effort to cut down on paper. So keep everything fresh in your mind, how you thought today went, what you would have liked to have seen, and you'll get that follow-up from me. So with that, I set you all free. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you at a DPC event soon.